the webinar will be recorded so that we can post this to our resource library and everybody will have access to it. Kimmy and I will be sending the recording out once we're finished with this in the next few days. And so if we could get everybody to introduce themselves in the chat, just so that we can see where everybody's coming from. So if you could please include your name, your pronouns, and your land acknowledgement in the chat, that would be great. And as you can probably see, we do have ASL interpretation available for this presentation, trying to make sure that there's as much access for everybody as possible. So our speakers are going to try and make sure that we speak very clearly and at an even pace so that we can make sure that the interpreters can keep up with what's being said. So we're going to start off with having our speakers introduce themselves and tell us what their prevention journey has been and how they got into prevention in the first place. So to kick us off and get us started, I'm going to pass it over to Rico.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rico Ramos. I use he, him pronouns and serve as the Director of Prevention, Education, and Advocacy Services at the Center for Community Solutions that's down here on Kumeyaay land, what is now San Diego. And, you know, as I was talking to the team here about my journey in prevention, it's a bit embarrassing to share, but I think it's helpful to share that I started because I witnessed friends and loved ones who were impacted by relationship and sexual violence. And so this past Rico was fired up to do something about it. And I tried to do something about it the only way that I knew how, and thought, I'm going to get into this field so I can put them all in jail and get everybody out of here. And I entered the field and got a really cold shower. And so started my work here actually at Center for Community Solutions a few years ago. Was a prevention educator in the community, worked with youth in detention facilities, worked in schools, community spaces with parents and other community members. Then transitioned out, was in higher ed and did Title IX work for the last 5 years, taught there and such. But throughout the whole time, I learned so much, and I'll say that this field helped me transform into a better man. It helped me learn how to do it right, how to empower others and use my privilege to elevate others. And I think I got to the ultimate goal in the end, to be doing prevention work, to provide support for survivors in my community, for my friends and loved ones that were impacted by it. But I learned a lot throughout the journey. You know, so my journey was just as much as doing prevention work as working in myself and a lot of self-reflection. And to this day, continue to do some of that work to really transform the way that I show up and the way that I do the work. And now I'm back, just recently came back to CCS in December, and really excited to continue doing this work from a social services perspective rather than the university level that I was doing for the past few years. And it's exciting, it's invigorating to come back and continue to do this work in the community rather than just an educational institution. Yeah, I just love to share that, right? That my journey started from an unhealthy place. And I always shared with the youth is we can all work to be healthier. We can all work to get to a place where we can live healthy relationships and be in healthy community. And that was my journey, right? That was my journey and continues to be it. I will pass over to, how about Luis?
Thank you, Rico. Hi, everyone. My name is Luis Canseco Garcia. I use pronouns he, him, his, and I'm calling in from Kumeyaay land, now known as North County, San Diego, and I'm with the Community Resource Center. So my journey. So my educational background has always been about criminal justice, sociology, and justice studies. So that's something that from a very early age, I remember back in high school, growing up in Vista. Vista back then used to be the barrio or the ghetto, right? And I remember seeing a lot of injustices at an early age, and I would always question like things such as, why are my friends being incarcerated, right? Or why is there so much violence in my neighborhood? And so that's what got me into college, because that's the only thing that I was interested in. I was not interested in anything else, history and math, sciences, or the other hard sciences and stuff. No, it was just finding out those answers that I had questioned myself since an early age. And so I went to school to study that. And while in school, I did a lot of community work, working with different populations, with elderly folks, working with formerly incarcerated people. And that I learned so much. And then it was when I finished grad school that I received I received this opportunity, right? So CRC, they sent the job opening to my school, and then my director at the school, she shared it with me, and then I applied, and I was really fortunate to get a job right after grad school, because that usually doesn't happen, right? um, uh, and so I started working at CRC, and I was very interested in the position because it was domestic violence education and prevention specialist. And so doing work in the community while I was going to school, I was always fascinated by prevention, by preventing violence before it happens. I remember writing articles about prevention, right? How can we prevent? And so for me, when I saw that position, it was like, oh wow, like this is something I want to do. And so I applied, I got the job, and I started working right as a prevention specialist. Um, but my story is a little different from yours, Rico, that it was an actual experience that got you into this work. For me, it wasn't. Um, but what I noticed once I started working as a domestic violence prevention specialist, what happened is that what people find out where you work, either because you posted on social media or because your friends ask you, right? You're hanging out with your friends and they ask you, like, where do you work? And so people find out, right? Or you just share it with people, you share it with your family. And so something that started happening is that a lot of my friends, female friends, they started opening up to me about how they had experienced violence in these previous relationships. And also I had family members coming to me telling me, like, Luis, I experienced this violence as well. And so that right there is when it was like that since that moment, it's like I got really into it, right? It became really personal. And so so that is something that now that I teach, right, especially when I'm engaging men, is like, it's personal to all of us. Like domestic violence, sexual violence, it's personal to all of us, because we all know someone, or we all have someone in our lives that has been a victim of domestic violence or sexual violence. And so that's my journey, and that's kind of what got me into this work. And I really love prevention, and I like how people innovate and have ideas about how to prevent violence, because that's the world that I want to see, right? Like, we want to move towards that world where we can prevent violence before it happens. Yes, that's my journey, and I'll go ahead and pass it on to Dom.
Okay, thank you, sir. I appreciate that, and thank you all for putting on this wonderful event. My name is Dom Walltower. I'm a violence prevention advocate. My organization is Inspired Perspective, and I also work on base. I am a prevention education specialist working with the Marine Corps and in prevention of domestic violence. How I got started. Wow. Okay. All right. This is to Dr. Rico's point that I started from an unhealthy place. Let's just start off with that. My background is I come from a home of domestic violence. I grew up in that environment, and I became an offender myself. So becoming an offender myself, going through the process of that whole cycle of domestic violence myself, the denial, the anger, the frustration, the court system, incarceration, losing families, and losing my family, should I say, that prompted me to start a life change. And I mean a life change from a DNA level. And I had to go through a journey of healing to where I not only healed from the damage that was done to me throughout my life, but I had to heal from the damage that I caused others. And so for me, that was what I call 360-degree healing. And it motivated me to want to help others. As I went through the process of change, there were so many things and dynamics that I learned along that path that I said, oh my gosh, I know this little nuance, I know that nuance, and I have to help other people understand that. And so when I'm working with offenders, men or women, I can understand some of these nuances because I remember sitting in the places that they are currently in. So again, I was extremely motivated by my own background. And ironically enough, simultaneously as I was living a life of an abusive person, I worked in social services. I started off working in group homes. I worked for the probation, under probation contracts. I worked as a social worker and doing investigations. I worked for the school district. So I got to see all of these systems as I was going along my own process. And of course, that's not how it was designed. That's just how it happened. So I was learning about myself while I was still engaging in some of these negative behaviors. And so that gave me a great deal of knowledge about the systems and about how change happened. So once my life reached that point of, okay, I'm just done with this, I knew what to do because I had been exposed to these systems. I need therapy, I need counseling, I need medication, I need whatever I need something to change. And so that's when after my marriage ended and I took a look in the mirror, I recognized that I need to actually do the stuff that I'm telling other people to do. And so I started a journey of healing. Like I said, I was about 3.5 years of counseling, of different groups, classes, co-ed groups, men's only groups. And each one of them helped me to put together myself, my current self, who I am today. So everything that I do today with my own organization, Inspire Perspective, I am a public speaker. I speak at different conferences. I also teach classes in partnership with the San Diego District Attorney's Office. I'm about to start with Los Angeles County. I teach an 8-week anger management and domestic violence course. So I'm teaching that. I'm teaching on base. And so everything that I do comes directly from the fact that I was there. I was there and I remember what it was, and I remember how horrible I was and how horrible who I was, how it impacted the people around me. And I will never forget that. And so learning what I learned throughout this journey of healing prompted me to move, to take action. There was no way that I could just leave that circumstance and then just say, okay, well, everything's great now, let me move on. I had to start doing something. And I can't, to this day, I can't explain where that comes from, but there was just an extreme purpose in me that I have to go and start working with people to help them come out of this. So I say that I'm a victim advocate by way of offenders. So I don't work directly with victims. I work with offenders to help them get themselves together, because every offender that is healed and is accountable and healing, that's one less victim coming through the door of our organization. So I'm working side by side with everyone here. I'm just going upstream a little bit to kind of deal with those that are causing the harm. So that is my story, and I'm sticking to it. There's more to it, but from this point, I will pass it on to Quentin.
Thank you very much, Dom. And thank you to everybody who's here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about myself and my story. My name is Quentin Page. I work as the program manager at Doves, which is in Big Bear Valley on Serrano land in the San Bernardino Mountains. My pronouns are he and him and his. And my journey into prevention, I'm going to go all the way back. When I was a youth, I did not foresee myself working in prevention. I went to college at Cal State Fullerton, and I majored in psychology because I found it to be a very fascinating topic. I didn't really have a career plan planned out, which might not be the best thing to do, but I just kind of followed what interested me when I got to college. And once I was graduating and I interned at a local nonprofit and eventually ended up working there, which was a group home for teenage girls. And it was a great job and it was a challenging job. And I really found myself, benefiting from the work. I'm going to try to slow down my speech a little bit because I know that we have an ASL interpreter. So if you're like, why is he going slow now? That's why. I tend to speak quickly. But in doing that job, I really felt like my work mattered and I was helping people. These were young ladies who were going through a lot of difficulties in their life and who had very challenging upbringings full of domestic violence and things of that nature. We worked with victims of human trafficking and people who are struggling with addiction at a young age, unwanted pregnancies and all sorts of things. So again, it really challenged me, but I found purpose in it. I worked at that job for several years, but around the time I was getting into my mid-20s, I ran into a conflict where even though the work was worthwhile and meaningful, it wasn't quite paying the bills. I had a fiance, we wanted to start a family and set down roots, and I was working in Orange County, which is a very expensive place to live. And so I made a decision to, get out of that sort of work and go work in kind of private industry, for-profit businesses. And that was kind of a time of exploration. And what I came to realize is that sort of work is not for me. I was making okay money, but I didn't feel accomplished. I didn't feel like my work mattered in a way that I needed it to. So I think about 7 years ago, my wife and I made the decision to move to Big Bear, where fortunately, rents and mortgages and things of that nature were a lot cheaper at the time. And the cost of living was just a lot less. And I had the benefit of finding Doves, which is a domestic violence agency. I got hired in a administrative position as the program manager, but part of working at a small, company is that everybody kind of has to do a lot. So one of the roles I adopted early in my work was to manage the prevention program, which mostly entails going into local schools and working with students on things like healthy relationships, and warning signs of abuse and just facilitating those discussions around, what healthy and happy relationships look like. I have a real passion for that. I love working with youth. I love hearing from them and learning from them. I appreciate the California Partnership's efforts to bring youth into the conversation and really elevate their voices because I feel like they have a lot to say. And so I'm always, coming to the partnership for information and training. I've attended the Building Change Together, both sessions. So if you guys are considering going to that, please do, because I know I benefited from it massively in my position, and my management of the program over here at Doves. And yeah, so and I wanted to touch on, that fact that I was kind of driven out of this work because, we aren't compensated probably at the level that we should be. And so that's probably something that we want to, work to change. And I think I really faced a conflict at that time myself, being a young man and feeling that need. I think it's like a masculine thing to like want to provide for your family and, and have the bills paid. And I'm very fortunate to have a great partner who works as well. And we do okay. We're not struggling to pay the bills every month. We're definitely not rich, but it's thanks to the opportunity I found and that she's found and the willingness to work together, we're doing all right. But I don't think that's always the case, and it certainly wasn't the case for me in the beginning when you're just getting into the field. When you're trying to establish yourself and gain skills and knowledge, being compensated at a low rate can be a real challenge. So anyway, I kind of went off on a tangent about that. But I believe it's my turn to popcorn it over to Armando.
Thank you so much, Quentin. Well, my name is Armando Ruiz. My pronouns are he, him, and I work at Lumen Alliance, which is in San Luis Obispo, California. on Northern Tree Mesh land. My role at Lumen Alliance is as a prevention programs manager, and I supervise various school-based programs. My prevention journey, I'd say it started when I was back at university and I saw a poster on a wall for a seminar about intimate partner violence. And I tend to be pretty curious about things and pretty interested in new topics. So I thought, oh, I'll attend that. So I ended up auditing this seminar for the whole semester, and it was delivered by the director and assistant director of the local domestic violence and sexual assault agency. And so they told us that the hours you spent in the course would fulfill part of your domestic violence peer counselor certification. And so after I finished that seminar, I went to go finish that volunteer training at the local agency, and I started working on the crisis line. And so I feel like that was my first real entry point into the field, working on the crisis line. And it was very fulfilling work as a volunteer to do that on the weekends. And it was something that I was really interested in taking with me when I eventually would transition to the medical field. But I also, through being a volunteer, I was very engaged in other sort of tabling events, childcare, and eventually with a prevention program called Coaching Boys into Men, which there was a season that as a volunteer, I helped to deliver at a local high school. And that was around the same time that the pandemic began, and I was laid off in my other role. So I was invited to apply for that position at the agency. And so that's kind of how I became a prevention coordinator at Lumen Alliance. And then from there, my role evolved into multiple different components. As I think most preventionists understand, there's so many weird different programs that you end up doing. For a while, I continued to do school and community-based presentations. I did a little virtual teen Minecraft club for a while, a lot of juvenile services programming, sexual health education, parent education, other things like that. And so that's sort of how I entered the field. That's kind of my journey into prevention. But I think I just love educating on these topics, like healthy relationships, sexual assault, consent, boundaries, the cycle of violence. To me, they're all just so inherently interesting. And you learn a lot about yourself and others when you're talking about them and trying to pull examples out of your head, and the kids in the room, people are bringing up examples, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's a great example. It's just a really energizing environment. And I love to teach to adults, to kids, to service providers. And I think this education is just applicable to everybody. It's really powerful knowledge because it helps us see that healthy and fulfilling relationships are possible. And for a lot of people who don't grow up around healthy relationships, that can seem like a dream, or it can seem like it's an impossible thing. So to me, providing this education really feels like you're like providing hope to a lot of people. Like, this is how you can develop a healthy relationship. This is what it can look like. This is what you can say. This is what you can do. And so to me, it's really been a passion to find ways of making that education accessible to everybody in the community through like different learning styles, different settings, different formats. And that's why I do prevention. That's why I really enjoy it, and I think it'll always be with me with whatever I do later in life. So that's my journey, and that's how I got here today. So I think I'll pass it back to Melody, because I think everybody did their intro.
I'll take it from here. Oh,
No, go ahead, Kimmy.
thank you all so much for sharing. That was already just so fascinating in itself. Next, we want to ask all of you, what are some barriers to being a man in prevention in both the DV prevention field itself, but then also when you go out into the community? And so I don't know if anyone wants to start, or I can call on someone.
I'm happy to get started.
Thanks, Rico.
Yeah, so I've really been thinking about this. What are some of the challenges? And I will say there's challenges, and I also experience a lot of opportunity and privilege. So I'll preface it with that. One of the challenges I think that I experience both doing DV work and also just being in the community as someone who does this work is twofold. I think on one end, it's in my head. And when I show up to spaces, I'm telling myself these narratives that are influenced by the norms, right, in our society. Like, oh, they're going to think oh, they're going to say, oh, how am I going to be perceived? And I feel like I find myself really thinking, how am I going to show up into this space? What is what I'm going to say? How is that going to be impactful for individuals in a positive or a negative way? And there's a lot of that, what are they going to say type of thing. And then on the other end, there's not just the perceived or the internal struggle, but there's the actualized struggle that I have been in spaces where I show up and I can be triggering. My presence, my identity can be triggering to that space. And as it used to happen more when I first started, you are someone who is coming in and you're ready and you've been trained and you're equipped and you want to show up and share how to empower people. And then you are faced with the reality that you yourself might not be the right person to share that in that space, right? This is not everywhere. And I've experienced that in some spaces where I can be triggering because they are still in the healing journey, and my presence can do that. And so I would say that that's a challenge, right? There's both the actualized and the perceived. A couple of years ago, when I was doing this work in juvenile detention facilities, I would see how my colleague who identified as a woman would connect with the guys there versus how I was connecting with them. And when we first got that contract and I went in, I was thinking, oh, I'm all tatted up. I'm going to show up. It's going to be great. It's just going to be us and the boys talking about how to have healthy relationships. And that was not my experience. Again, how I showed up in the space in those spaces made some pretty big barriers because I was pushing against the norm. I was challenging what was expected of men and how men were to be talking in that particular space. And I would hear afterwards, my colleagues talking, oh, it was a great conversation. We went in so deep and had great dialogue around fixing or addressing some of the unhealthy patterns of behavior. And I just remembered on the drive home thinking, like, what am I doing wrong? How come I can't connect with them to that level? And it wasn't until I would meet those guys outside in the community, once they were released through additional programs we were doing on a one-on-one or in a smaller group, that they would really dive in deeper. And then it became not a challenge, but almost this added privilege, right? To be able to connect on a much, much deeper level as men, talking about how are we having relationships and what does it mean to live a healthy relationship. And so it's a weird balance. Sometimes it works in your favor and sometimes it closes all doors. And I just remember sitting there at first with the frustration of, what am I doing wrong? And it took some time to realize, Rico, it's not about you. It's not about what you're doing. It's about how is it being received and how are people being impacted by it. But I would say, yeah, that's one where it's both an internal, right, what I'm telling myself and how I have to keep myself on check, and an external, actualized, just because of the norms in our society. But I'll stop there and I'll pass it on. How about I'll switch over to Quentin.
Thank you, Rico. I appreciate you passing it to me. I was almost going to raise my hand. You touched, one of the last things you mentioned was societal norms. And I think that plays a big role in terms of the barriers of males getting into this field. I can share that I feel like I've been welcomed into the field with open arms, but I work in an agency that is entirely female, with the exception of myself up here in Big Bear. And I know if any of you fellas have ever gone to like the conferences or the meetings that are put on, it's usually about 5 of us and about 200 women, or, people of various genders, obviously, in the room. But, we tend to be kind of, the odd man out is a phrase that would certainly apply. And for whatever reason, I feel, comfortable in those environments. And I can, vibe with a feminine energy, if you will. And I feel comfortable, kind of, not mansplaining or anything like that, or, playing my role appropriately. But I do think, that in American society, particularly, I'm not well versed on the other societies or cultures of the world. But, we have these expectations that there are roles in our society which are masculine or feminine or both or whatever, and a lot of times when I meet people or explain to them what I do, or, we have a client who comes to our office who needs, aid, and I'm the one who's giving help at that time, giving counseling. It's kind of not just totally readily accepted, that a man would be in this role. A lot of people, I say, this is what I do, they find it very interesting, and that's the first thing they bring up. Oh, what's it like being a man and doing that? And I think, I'm perfectly fine with it. I enjoy that conversation. But I don't know that every male out there would be ready to kind of jump into a role like that, to be in a room with just you and, 30 other women or something like that. I think it's great, that in the beginning of the domestic violence movement, women really stepped up and built these programs and rallied to help out. And we all know that abuse can go in any direction, between genders. But I do think that in society, largely it's perceived as, men abuse women. And so to be a man in a role of prevention, I think we bring a very unique perspective to the table. I'll share an experience that really touched me one time when I was out in the community doing work. I had a young man in high school come up to me after I had finished a discussion that I facilitated after his peers had left the room, the bell had rung. And he came to me and said, I really appreciate you coming here today because I'll share that my dad abuses my mom, and I've always been worried that I myself am gonna, become like my dad. And that's a real fear I have. And having an opportunity to hear from you, Quentin, and to talk about, what I was experiencing and to see things in a new light, that really made an impact on me. And I got the sense that, as a matter of fact, now that I think about it, I did have a female co-presenter at that time, but he didn't necessarily come up to both of us. He just kind of came up to me and shared that hearing a male perspective, about healthy relationships really touched him, and so I think that while we do face, certain obstacles getting into the field, I think, having us here is valuable for various different reasons. And that was actually something that my manager pointed out to me like the week I was hired. She said, I really think it's great that we have a man on staff now. We've never had one. And I think you can bring a unique perspective. And so, I encourage everybody to kind of look at it from that lens, which, is a shift because, again, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it's a largely, feminine industry, domestic violence work, which is not a problem by any means, but it could, deter folks from thinking like, oh, maybe that's for me. Maybe I should apply for this job. I don't know. I'm happy to popcorn it, but did any of you guys want to get in next? You can raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. All right, popcorn, Luis.
Hey, thank you, Quentin. Yes, well, so similar to Rico's experience, like people, I don't know if it's just me internally or it's happening, it's really happening, right? But I feel like people do make assumptions about you. And I'll share this experience. So one time I was presenting at a university here in San Diego, and it was in person. It was back in 2019. And, I present about CRC, who we are, the services that we provide. Then I talked about domestic violence, what domestic violence is. And then I finished by talking about what prevention is and why I think prevention is important, right? I share with everyone my why. And so it was time for Q&A, and people were asking questions, right? And then this older woman asked me, why do you care about this? It was an interesting question, right? And so it was funny for me because I had already shared why I cared about this, right? And so, but she wasn't satisfied, and so I asked her, "Can you be more specific about your question?" And she said to me, which nobody should ever ask this question, right? But she asked me, "Were you abused?" And so it was at that moment that I realized, well, I started to wonder that if people think or make these assumptions about you, and my professor, mentor, he was there. He stepped in really fast, right? He said, "Luis, you don't have to answer that." But I did, I did answer that, and I told her that I was not abused, right? But that it's our responsibility as males to speak up against this, right? The same way that you don't have to be a person of color to speak up against racism, you don't have to be a woman or a survivor of gender-based violence to speak up against sexism, right? And I think she was very satisfied. But since that day, I do wonder if people make these assumptions about me. Uh, like Quentin was saying, it is an industry of mainly women. And so I also wonder if people question my gender, so that's another barrier. Not really a barrier, but it's something that it does make me wonder. Um, um, because I even seen it in my own family, right? Like, for example, one time, so me being a single man, one of my uncles, um, he asked me that question about my gender, and because he knows about the work that I do, he knows that I advocate for, for ending domestic violence, for women's rights, for gender equity, right? He sees me doing this work, and then he sees me single, and then he's asking me about my gender, right? And so that's another thing. So I do wonder if people make these assumptions about me or us, as men doing this work. So yeah, those are some barriers that and another thing also, another barrier, I guess, also in the community is also in my family. uh, so I was born and raised in Oaxaca, Mexico. And so my whole life I've been surrounded by machismo. Till this day, I'm surrounded by machismo. That's just the truth, right? Even in my friend circles. And I do call them out, right? And I do it as much as I can, but I just can't be doing it 24/7. I'll go to the barber shop, and there's a group of men that talking, referring to women with certain degrading words, right? Or speaking about women in a really unhealthy, toxic way. And so it's just around you, as a man, it's just around you all the time. And so um is it a challenge? I mean, maybe it's not a challenge, it's a privilege that you can speak up, and step in and say something. um but it can also be overwhelming. I think that's what I can say, because even with my family too, this is another family example. We were having a family party. It was a gathering, and one of my uncles, he asked me, "Luis, when are you gonna get married?" Right? And so I said, well, being a single person, right? I'm like, well, for first I will have to find a girlfriend, and then he's like, "When you find a girlfriend, make sure that she knows how to cook, and she knows that she's clean." Right? And so my uncle's asking me these things, while we are at a party, a family, a Saturday, while we're drinking some beers, right? So it's around you. Machismo is around you. So it's something that you're constantly confronting. And maybe maybe it's a barrier and also a privilege at the same time, because you as a man, you can speak against that. Anybody else wants to speak on this?
I was gonna say, Luis, I mean, and it's such a challenge, right? Because when you do this work, there's this expectation that, like, all right, show up, right? You go and talk about this, you do it every day, and now you're here with the boys and they're saying XYZ, I'm staying quiet. Right. And sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes I do call them out. I'm like, come on, fellas. And sometimes I wonder, will it cause further barriers to do that slow little chiseling to change those social norms, those views, if I call them out today versus, you know what, I'll catch you later. And we kind of slowly start bringing it in, slowly start having them transform. But it's a struggle, right? Because, you know, like we do a whole unit, a whole section on bystander intervention. And here I am telling youth and the community members, show up. What are you gonna do? And then I experience it, and you don't do anything. And so there's that internal struggle. But it is, I mean, the machismo, I experienced that too, Luis. And you know, being Mexican and growing up, I grew up in Ensenada, transferred over here, same thing. No matter where, it follows you and the family, and it's so ingrained in society that little kids, little ones, right, who are barely learning how to speak, and they learn that right away. So definitely deeply rooted.
I'll chime in on that point. I'll go next, but I do want to respond to what Luis and Dr. Rico were talking about. These are nuances that men bring to the table. The strategy and how to confront, because when people say, hey, call them out, and it's like, well, in the male world, if I don't respect you or I don't care about what you say, you can say whatever you want to say. I don't care, because I have no relationship with you. And what Dr. Rico's talking about is like, if I have a relationship with this man, then I'll have a better chance of working on this. I like the terminology you use. You said chiseling. And that's exactly what it is. It's chiseling. It's one step at a time. So the direct confrontation is not always a good strategic method. Now, sometimes it works. I was in the barbershop and I did have that direct conversation with some of the guys in the barbershop. But then there's other times when I was like, oh, well, no, this one is going to require a little bit, this is a chess game here. So let me go ahead and use some strategy with that. And it definitely is something that is not, if you don't understand the male world, you'll think, hey, just say it. And like, well, no, that doesn't work all the time for us. We are very, very stubborn. We are, we're just built different. Like our minds don't work the way that some people think that they do. But to be able to choose how to navigate that circumstance. If I call another man out in front of another group of men, that might be a fight. That might be a fight. So I mean, I have to, I pull that person aside and have a conversation with him. And that all depends on the relationship that I have with that man. If I don't have a relationship with that man, he does not respect anything about me, then what I say does not matter. It's like, oh, well, that punk Dom said this. I'm not listening to him. I don't care what he said. The machismo, that they're talking about, in the Black community, we have the same thing. We just call it different names. We have the same, you have to be macho, you have to be this. But I think that is an extremely important point to bring up, and how to confront this. Bystanders, if you don't have an in with the group that you're talking to, what you're saying is just, it's almost irrelevant. I don't want to say irrelevant, but it's like, whatever. We don't care what Luis said. I don't even know him. But if I know you and I say, oh, I respect that guy. Oh, man, Luis did say that. You know what? Let me think about that. So anyways, I don't want to go off on that too much, but that's a very important point. Now, to the barriers for me specifically is the triggering, as Dr. Rico talked about. Myself, I am a huge trigger to any room that I walk into, based on my background, where I come from, what I actually disclose and what I talk about. It is a trigger for people, and I understand it. And so at the beginning of this conference, we talked about the grounds that we're on, where we come from, what particular city we're coming from. And I feel like this arena that has been built by women, I feel like it's sacred ground in the same way. It's sacred ground, and I've had to learn how to walk on these grounds. It wasn't just, hey, let me walk on these grounds and just say whatever and do whatever because I'm a man. No, I feel like it's a humbling experience that I feel like, it's just me personally, I feel like all men need. I feel like we need that. We need the humbling experience of being in being the minority in this scenario where it's our opinion, our thought process is not the dominant factor. And so early on for me, that was a challenge in figuring out how to do that. And but I figured it out pretty quickly because it was just, okay, it's respect. It's respect. I figured out it's respect. I have to respect the space that I'm in. I've gotten emails, and I've gotten face-to-face conversations where people are, hey, I don't like what you do. I don't agree with what you do. You shouldn't do it. And in that space, there was no anger towards that person. I said, I appreciate your opinion. I understand why you feel that way. Trust me, I get it. I know exactly why you feel that way. So it's even respecting the people that don't agree with, males in this space, and then particularly those that have caused, harm. So I think that, some of those are barriers, but I mean, a quick story, there was a young lady who was sitting in the audience in one of my presentations, and she came up to me after, and she said to me, she said, you know what? I'm going to be honest with you. She said, I heard you speak about a year ago, and I didn't listen to a damn thing that you said. She said, I didn't want to hear it. She said, I just didn't want to hear it. And she said, this time I listened. And she says, I understand why you do what you're doing now. And she said, my son plays for this certain organization, this college. She says, I would like for you to contact the athletic director and speak to their team. I say that story to say that I didn't do anything different, but continue to walk in a humility and respect. And so she was able to come to her own conclusion about what I did. I didn't have to go chasing her and say, hey, I'm a good dude. I'm not all men. I didn't have to do any of that. I just continue to walk in respect, walk in honor. And I feel like that came back around in its own time, And I do feel like those people that are triggered, I feel a tremendous amount of respect towards them and why they feel that way. And so that was something early on I did not know what to do. I do understand what to do with it now. There are, this being a female dominated arena, some of your motives are questioned. What are you here for? Like, what do you want? Are you here for the girls? Or are you here for like, what are you doing over here? And so, and again, looking at any of that comes towards me with a sense of respect and honor for where that place is coming from, understanding where it comes from, and then just allowing the process to happen the way that it needs to happen. Not to go into mansplaining why I'm here, not to go into, having to really take over a room. No, just allowing the process to happen is something that I've learned. But it's definitely, that was difficult. And another difficulty that I've found is the perspective of men is different. And so sometimes explaining how the male mind works is not always received. And how we operate, and they say, well, it should be this way. And I was like, yeah, it probably should be, but this is how we are. Like, this is what we are. So sometimes that's not always received. But even in that arena, to me, again, it's about respect. I feel like the tide will change with whatever problem is that we're facing. It's going to change. It's already changing. It's changing before our eyes. And California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, when I started a few years back doing a workshop, the title of the conference was Shifting the Lens, which I just love. A shout out and a plug to you all, because you guys are phenomenal. You guys are phenomenal. But it was shifting the lens, and so I think that lens is going to shift no matter what, and we just have to make sure that we are. I have to make sure that I'm making sure that that lens is going to shift naturally, and I'm not the person forcing people to shift their lens. And so, being a male, we're considered dominant. We're considered, the leaders and all of that. But how do we operate in humility? How do we operate in love, in compassion, in empathy? how do we operate on this? Like I said, I truly consider this as hallowed, sacred ground. That how do we operate there? And for me, I feel like it's been a privilege to be. It is a privilege daily to be in this arena. So those are a few challenges. Definitely, there are some privileges too, and then we're going to talk about that next. And I will punt this over to Armando. What say you, sir?
So, thanks, Dominic. Wow, a lot of stuff's been covered already. I'm trying to find where I fit into this conversation, but a couple of things popping up in my mind. One is that when we teach about violence, there's a large gender aspect. We call that gender-based violence. The components related to how masculinity and the qualities that you can learn from it are associated or increase the likelihood or pressure men into causing violence to themselves or to others around them. When you grew up with that culture and then you're encountered by a field that's saying, those aspects of your identity are problematic, I'm describing this as sort of a barrier to entry to the field where it requires a lot of self-reflection and learning and to sort of change your perception of those qualities before you can enter the field. It's something that I think it would be really difficult to understand if you grew up with much more, you identify more with feminine qualities, because you can say, yeah, those masculine qualities are harmful. I'm going to go teach about them. But if you're a guy and you're walking in the field and you're like, yeah, those masculine qualities are harmful, but I sort of still identify with them. Am I really the right person to teach about this? Am I really the right person? You have sort of self-doubt, a little bit of that imposter syndrome, thinking, I don't think I'm cut out to teach about something that I identify so strongly with, and I'm trying to even learn about and change myself. I really respect the work you do, Dom. That's incredible that you're able to approach the work the way you do, because it's even something that I struggle with, to talk about masculinity in a way that balances also healthy aspects, because there's sometimes the impression that I feel like I can sometimes leave on youth that I teach is that, there's nothing good about masculinity. It's a terrible problem. And I don't want that to be the message that's ever sent. And so maybe this is part of the obstacle, or also part of how to engage men, is to do more to conceptualize what healthy masculinity looks like, create better options, create better sort of archetypes, better role model, ideas that you can also teach. And until that, until we get, I don't know, list of healthy qualities, list of healthy masculine qualities or something like that, it might be a little challenging for men to continue to enter the field and teach about healthy masculinity without having, exactly a good model to work off of. So I guess the whole barrier I describe is it's hard to teach something that you're still trying to process through. And so that's a barrier to entry for men. And another barrier, I think completely separate, is that the field is, there's a big lack of invitation towards men, because it doesn't seem like domestic violence or sexual assault services are services, or even a movement for men. And it doesn't really present itself as a men's problem because of the stereotype that we're talking about with female victims and male perpetrators. And I'm sure everyone's seen that video by Jackson Katz, Violence Against Women, It's a Men's Issue. It's very well known. And we all, anyone in sexual assault, intimate partner violence has probably seen that video. But we also know that any victim or perpetrator can be anybody of any sex or gender. But that stereotype is really institutionalized within the work. And we have a Violence Against Women Act. We have a Office of Violence Against Women. We have bills about violence against women, even curriculums that specify components about how boys are saying stuff that's harmful towards girls. And so at every level of the field, it's presented as an issue where it's violence of men against women. And in our very sort of heteronormative culture, there's also just the assumption that if we're talking about violence against women, we're assuming men are the perpetrator. And so these are all sort of like, I don't know, institutional structural issues, because we could just as easily have, Interpersonal Violence Act, or the Office of Violence Against People, or Office of Violence Against, Office of Sexual Assault, Intimate Partner Violence. So I think there's a shift that can occur there to make the field more inviting. And that's to not sort of, undermine or underplay the, 50 years of work that women have done to build the field and build the work and create even this space to have these conversations. But, I think about that sometimes the way that the field looks from the outside with the laws, the bills, the regulations, even, just it's been less than 7 years that our organization was previously called the Women's Shelter. All those things make a difference in engaging men and really making it feel like it's not a space where men are allowed, or that if you enter the field, you're the odd one out. So those are some components that I think can create obstacles. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for answering that question, and for being able to jump off each other's responses. I think that was really great. So for the sake of time, we want to end with our kind of like now what question. So I want to pass it back to all of you and ask you, what do you think we can do to engage more men and bring more men into the movement of violence prevention? And, if you feel so inclined to mention, what are some of the privileges or access that you have in being a man in the movement, that would be great. But otherwise, really what we want to focus in and hone in on is what are some of those privilege, what are ways that we can bring more men into the movement. So I'm wondering, since you went the last couple of times, Armando, would you want to kick us off with this question?
Okay. I can kick it off with that question. What are some privileges? So the one that first comes to mind is that I am, vastly less likely to be sexually harassed by an audience. That's something that all my female colleagues have had some experience with, and I have yet to encounter. And so, that's something that I don't think about when I'm going into a session, and it's something that I definitely consider a privilege. I do like the component that a couple other of you mentioned, that there's a male nuance that's presented through men in the field. And I also like how you guys brought it down to, it's in its all kind of the implementation and how bystander intervention training is even taught. It kind of shows certain components. I think that I've experienced that too in a couple of ways where you can tell a group of kids, like, don't do this, it's wrong, don't do this, it's disrespectful. And their questions are gonna be like, why? Why is it disrespectful? Why can't I do that? And so I guess in my time here, I've really tried to find the answer to that question and be able to incorporate it into the education. And the way that I teach it now is that, to create a healthy relationship, you need healthy boundaries. Everybody has boundaries and needs. You need to communicate those boundaries. You need to ask consent before crossing those boundaries, all those things. And so when I teach, I think the angle that I've been able to get, partly because, I'm a guy in this field, is that when I work with boys, they need better explanations, they need justifications for this stuff. And they also need to understand that it applies to them. I think it's been remarkable how many times I've taught boys about healthy relationships and that they deserve their boundaries to be respected too. And they feel like that's odd. They feel it's strange. They're like, oh, we think this is just something we're supposed to respect for girls, but I guess we do have to respect ourselves. And there's so many examples of on sports teams, even, slapping each other's butts with, towel whipping, jumping on each other, complete disrespect of boundaries. And to be told that can cross lines, that can be disrespectful, it's a whole new message that's being received. And so I feel like a good way to engage and bring men into the field is to teach them as young as possible that they're deserving of respect of those boundaries as well, because it's so much easier to respect other people's boundaries when you recognize yours are supposed to be respected too. So I like that approach, that you go in and you teach everybody has these boundaries, everybody should respect these boundaries, and suddenly it creates this framework for the conversation of sexual assault and intimate partner violence that has a foundation, much better foundation, I think, than talking about like respect in a more abstract way. And yeah, I think that's, I can pass it off. Let's see, Rico.
You know, one of the, and I've seen a shift even from when I was here at CCS about 4 or 5 years ago to coming back, same organization, same community that we're serving, that it's less so, but there's still a little bit, and this is my experience, I can't speak for the field as a whole, this sense that masculinity is unhealthy and it's toxic and you know, and that's the problem, right? It's masculinity. And if we just addressed it and fixed it, then it would be better. And I think that's a way that it actually pushes out a lot of men, because there are some men that those masculine stereotypical traits, they identify in that, right? And they identify in being tough and being all those things, right, that we can put into that box. And I found that when I approach the conversation that way and say, that's not what's unhealthy, all right, fellas, like what's unhealthy is the choices and the actions we're making. So let's talk about what we do, not who we are. And that has opened up ears when I'm talking with men, and this is both men adults and youth men, where then it disarms it. You're not attacking who they are and what they've grown up to be all these years of, right? It's okay. It's a choice that I've made that I can control that choice. And that opens the door to having the conversation, to go in deeper. And like I said, that has changed quite a bit as I come back into this field in this area, in this arena. And I think that there's still, at least in my experience, it's changed in the sense that the field has opened up to all genders. And so it's okay, all genders and all identities, and you know, everyone in this galaxy is welcome now into the field. And there's still some remnants of, well, hold up though, but there's this unhealthy, toxic masculinity that we got to point out, like that's the issue. And I think that creates barriers for those that do identify themselves in some of those even more rigid gender norms, right? And see themselves in that way. And again, there's work to be done in those areas as well. And I've noticed that that's what opens the door, right? Or even the window. If we just say, hey, it's not about who you are, how you live, but it's about, hey, what are the choices we're making? What is the behavior? How is it impacting others? How it's impacting yourself? And that's a strategy that I've used currently with some men, specifically the dads. I'm working on opening up a dads group. And, you know, at first they came in thinking, yeah, we got to protect our daughters. Like no one's going to date them. I'm like, all right, there's a window. All right, I can talk to you through the window. We'll get to the door and we'll get to the couch in a while. But for now, we'll talk through the window. And you know, with a lot of men, you know, Dom, you mentioned this too, is sometimes you got to take what you get and then work to getting to that living room where we can have a meal, have a deeper conversation, and start doing that sustainable change, right? Sustainable change, not just the one conversation where I call you out so you won't do it in that space, but you're going to go back home and do it there, right? It's how do we make a sustainable prevention that we're getting to the root of it. Pass it on. Someone else has something to share, or all?
So if I may ask, what was the original question again?
So the question was that we wanted the panelists to answer is, what can we do to bring more men into the movement?
So I'm not a panelist, but I would love to include my 2 thoughts in there. I mean, to me, it's really simple. You just got to invite them to participate in the conversation. And it looks really like it's very different inviting men into the conversation. I would say you can't sometimes you can just be like, hey, you want to come have this conversation with me? And sometimes you have to be a little bit more strategic, as I think some of the panelists have already expressed earlier. But to me, I think you really got to learn to speak their language, and basically make it in a way that's common sense to them in order to participate. So as Rico was talking about, right, it's like, you're saying that he was doing some group with fathers and was like, oh, they came in saying, I don't want my daughter dating him. And I'd be like, well, I mean, that's going to happen regardless. So wouldn't you rather that your daughter married somebody or who represented and this is of course a gender binary in this case, like who would represent, a loving relationship, right? Like wouldn't, and in order for you to lead your daughter into that, you would have to represent that as well in your own family, right? So I think there's a lot of privilege in what you can say as well as a man. But to me, an example that comes, and I like to share, I like to be authentic when I do my groups with the young men. So I share some of my personal experiences. And I'm like, this is how I was learned this and how I see that it is wrong now, in order that how I was taught this and how I reinforce this. I'm just hoping that you really don't have, you can learn from my mistakes and not have to do it. And I really emphasize, I really personally am against the term like toxic masculinity, because the term masculinity and femininity, there is really no definition of what it is. We as a society decide what the characteristics and traits are of masculinity and femininity, and it can be totally switched around, right? But I'm just like, what I tell my youth is like, those traits that are defined as toxic masculinity are kind of really highlighted. It's really kind of taken over the entire term of masculinity is, and it's really not fair because it's basically putting the young man into a small category of what being a whole human being is, and that's not really fair for them. It's not fair for anybody in the LGBTQ community or anybody who's a woman or any of that. So, but what I try to do is I try to put it in a way that I understand it, and I think also like whoever's saying it has a very like the messenger also matters, right? And I can think of an experience where in my privilege, I would say a little bit over a year ago, I wrote this article on why men don't like to wear masks, for the masculinity part of it. And that article was published and I shared it within my own like stuff, my own like, communities. And it was really interesting because I see a lot of like my colleagues get a lot of backlash, and I got absolutely zero backlash from it. And I even had me as a military man, I shared it with a lot of people who are across the nation who are like military and so-called identify, like people would identify them as toxic masculinity, and they would actually come to me and be like, I just didn't see it in this way before, So I think it's just really rephrasing the invitation and being like, hey, the reality is domestic violence and violence against women, it affects everybody because not only does it happen to men, but it affects us when it happens to the people we care about in that situation. And I'm like, if it happens to 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men, like most likely somebody, if it's not yourself, somebody who has dealt with this, either sexual assault or violence. And we really got to encourage being that upstander and being that person to who's willing to stand up, right? And to me, when I said earlier, reframing it, it's kind of like, I think it takes a lot of courage to step up against something that it's so common and that you can actually get negative consequences just for going against the grain, and then it's just like, I think you really got to encourage that traits, I would say, of like, hey, there is no way into this masculinity thing. It's like, if you don't stand up and do something right, then you're a failure as a man. If you stand up and do something right, you're also like, you can also be viewed as failure as a man. So why not just be the person you want to be and not care about what others say? And of course, there's so much more to that, but I think really we have to invite more men in the conversation and give room to invite that and have that invitation as well. Just my two thoughts, I guess.
I'll
Thank you,
piggyback off of
Jonathan.
that. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate that. That conversation about toxic masculinity. I'm on a Marine base, and I work with Marines, and so I definitely have to speak exactly. Yeah, I definitely have to speak the language of the Marine Corps in order to get through to these men and women on this base. And I think it's when we're talking, and when we talk about toxic masculinity, so I share with them about my past life and how I was a poster boy for toxic masculinity. And I talk to them about the spectrum of masculinity. It's not just one arena, it's a spectrum. And so when you go all the way to the right, that's where you have toxic masculinity. You have rape culture. You have the joking rape culture. You have people who are talking about roofies. Who's got the roofies? You have people, men who are engaged in domestic violence, men who are engaged in sexual assault. That is toxic. And we have to be able to say that. And I talk to men about, and I say, we go to the other extreme, and where you have men who are trying to change things, or men who are being providers and helping their families and doing things like that. So there's a spectrum of toxic masculinity. When people hear that, they automatically go to the right side of it and say, well, that's the only thing they're talking about. No, and I tell them, I said, when I was an abusive person, I was toxic. I was a toxic man. That was 100% who I was. And I said, once I was able to change, I moved out of toxic behaviors. Now we can have a conversation about toxic femininity, and that's another conversation as well. But this term toxic masculinity gets people up in arms. But I think if we explain it, to Jonathan's point, in a different way, to where people can see and understand it, it is a spectrum. It is not the totality of men. Being a man is not toxic. If I'm abusing someone, then I become toxic. If I'm, taking advantage, then I become toxic. And, I think it's the same in the feminine realm. So I think it's important to have that conversation and to get people to understand. Now, one of the privileges I'll say quickly is being a man. I understand that men listen to other men. There's sexism all in that. Let's just get it out the way. I'm sorry, it's there. And that is a reality. So now I know that men will listen when I speak. So and I need to speak to them in a way that shows them that I respect them, and that I'm not talking down to them. So when I talk about toxic masculinity, they will listen because they know that I'm not trying to talk down to them or tell them they're monsters or you're horrible. And so they will listen. So that's one of the privileges that we have when we walk into a room. They're looking at us as men because we learn from each other. We get the permission to do something from each other. I think every man on this screen that walks into a room as who you are and what you do, you are inviting other men. You are inviting, when they see you speak and they see you, wait, you're talking about domestic violence? Oh my gosh, you're a man. Oh, okay. You have just co-signed the fact that this is okay. So the fact that we're showing up on this platform and we're showing up other places, we're saying that it's okay. I even think about marketing to men, how we market domestic violence. What are we used to seeing on the billboards when it comes to domestic violence? There's no men in the picture. There may be 6 women in the picture that says stop domestic violence. And as a man, when I look at that, oh, that has nothing to do with me. There's nothing to do with me. So if we had a picture, let's say, of all the men on here, and we were like, hey, stop domestic violence, men are going to look at that and say, oh, wait, because we see ourselves. We see ourselves. The NFL had a commercial out some years ago about domestic violence. And I was like, yes, they did like one commercial, but I was like, yes, because a masculine, a leader in the masculine realm actually said something about this. Now they typically stay away from this because they don't want the controversy, but the fact that they said something about this speaks to men and lets them know that this is something that, we need to address. So how to invite more men into this is by us men already out there doing this and saying this. Every time I show up to a presentation and they see me speaking, they understand, oh, a man is saying this. I'm talking to them about sexual assault. I'm talking to them about domestic violence. That gives them permission to, and like some of the gentlemen said before, creating space for us and allowing us into this space, I think is intentionally, much like the partnership is doing, I think is a phenomenal move, because we are going to, we're partnering alongside, of women and saying, okay, hey, look, we're saying the same thing. We're saying the same thing. We may just be speaking different languages, but we do, the last privilege I'll say is that we do bring the nuances to men to the table. There was a presentation that we did on base, and the reviews that we got from the presentation were that the men wanted more diversity in the presentation. And so my two female colleagues, they said, okay, well, we need to add, same-sex scenarios to this. And I said, whoa, hold on, you're missing this. This is a room full of Marines. The video that they were showing was a video that was showing male to female violence. What they wanted was something showing when they are abused as well. But my female colleagues, and they're wonderful people, they didn't understand that. And I had to explain to them, hey, no, this is what they're asking for. They're asking for to show that, hey, what happens when she hits me? What happens when we had no video showing that. And so that's a privilege I was able to give them and help them to understand that it's not, we are different. We're just different. And if you know our language, if you know how to talk to us, we will listen. But so that's just a few privileges that I have, and a couple ways to bring men to the table. I will punt this. Is it going to Kimmy? Who is it going to? I'm not sure. Okay, Quentin, there he is.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time. I'll do my best to be brief. Thank you, Dom, and everybody. I'm really happy that we got to work on unpacking this idea of toxic masculinity and masculinity in general. I think when we talk about men in the field, most men, are not being abusive. Most men want to help. I think it's a positive masculine trait. Rico touched on it. Men want to protect those around us. He said, he was in that class with dads and they're like, yeah, let's protect our daughters and never let them date anybody. We want to protect. We don't know how. Men don't understand, how to effectively do this work. You guys probably do, but men in general. One of my favorite conversations I get to have as a preventionist is when people come into our office and ask us, the scenario where, hey, I have a loved one, they're in an abusive relationship. What do I do? How do I help them? They usually say something like, I've done everything in my power to convince them to leave this person. And if they're a male, then they probably say something like, I'm at the point where I'm just going to go beat this guy up because he won't leave my daughter alone, or he won't leave my sister alone, or, whatever it may be. And I feel really, excited to have this conversation because usually I get excellent feedback from it. And what I do as a preventionist and as an interventionist is I try to help that person whose loved one is being abused understand what it's like to be in that situation as a victim. How torn that person is. A thought experiment I always do with everyone who's in the scenario is say, think about someone who you love and who you care about, and think about how difficult it would be to just never talk to that person again. They're not gone. They're reaching out to you. They're saying, hey, what's going on? I want to, are you okay? Why are you ignoring me? And I tell them, hopefully this isn't someone who's abusing you, but it's someone you love. It's someone you care deeply about. And what if I asked you today to just never talk to that person again? That'd be a very hard thing to do. And it starts to help them understand like what their loved one is going through. And really ultimately, I think we've all at some point touched on the idea of respect. And as a male, in my position, I've had many people come to me and say, hey, here's my situation. Tell me what I should do. Or when I go present in classrooms, the teacher will say, okay, this is Quentin. He's going to tell you guys how to have healthy relationships. And that is not my role, to tell people what to do or how to do it. And when I'm put in that role, it's not always easy. Sometimes I feel like, okay, now I got to tell them, no. People are experts on their own relationships, and if you can just, as a man, let that person know, hey, I am here for you. If there's anything you need me to do for you, I'm happy to do it. If you'd like to talk to me, I'll do my best not to judge you or to tell you what I want you to do. That's a very challenging thing to do, but I'm a firm believer that that's the best way to do this work. And when we talk about bringing men into our field, the first thing I think about is like, how can we hire more men? How can we train them? How can we make them advocates or preventionists? But I think it goes a step beyond that. There are plenty of men who are doing other roles, be it teachers or, any job really, who can, help us with our work in their roles, in their roles as parents or brothers or, community leaders or whatever, medical professionals. If we can equip them to, be understanding of the plight that victims are going through, be open and active and non-judgmental listeners, understand that they can make referrals to us, and explain the work that we do if people need another level of care and assistance. I think that goes a long way to engaging men in that conversation. So that's it for me.
I'm just going to jump in for 1 second to say, I know we have a few minutes left. Would love to hear from Luis, but for folks that need to get going at noon, we will go a little bit over just so we can hear what Luis has to say. But everyone who needs to go, thank you for attending. This has been fabulous. And I'm going to put in the chat our information for how to join our peer prevention network to find out about more upcoming webinars. This will also be posted to our resource library soon. So if you do miss the end, you'll be able to catch it later. Right, Luis, if you want to add anything to all of that, sorry to jump in.
Thank you, Kiwi. And yes, that was a lot, but I'll go ahead and share. So, I just want to acknowledge that there is a lot of privileges about being a man in the field and doing this work. There is, right? From, being able to talk to other men, right? Because just by nature, we just, we listen to people we can relate to, right? And so that's a privilege. Also as an educator and working in the community, talking to key people out in the community, such as going to talk to principals and board members, that's a privilege that I've seen as a man when I'm talking to our male principal about bringing this education to the school. They're more open to that because I'm a man and I'm there talking to them, right? So, the other example would be me going to coaches as a man talking to another male coaches about educating their athletes about this, right? So those are all privileges. And there's many other privileges about being a male in the field, such as, I know that men are more likely to ask for raises, for example, right? So yeah, those are other privileges as well. Now about engaging men, I was really thinking about what Armando said earlier about having that self-doubt. So there was a point a couple of years ago when I felt that, when I was going through that, when I had that self-doubt of am I the right person to be teaching about healthy relationships, right? Because me myself, I'm flawed, right? I've done unhealthy things too. And so I think that's really important because that's something that we need to teach our young men, that, hey, I'm here and we're going to talk about healthy relationships, but I'm also flawed, and I'm not here to shame anybody, right? Because statistically, if we say that, 1 out of 3 girls will experience violence, then that means that in that room, a room of 25 kids, there's probably people there who have caused harm, right? And whether physically, emotionally, or verbal, there's people in that room when you're teaching kids who have caused harm or who maybe do say a lot of sexist stuff. And so my approach is not to shame anybody about, the wrongdoings that they've done, but to allow them to understand that, hey, we're not perfect, right? And we make mistakes, and it's about growth. And so I share with them too that, hey, I teach about healthy relationships, but I have a lot of flaws and I've done a lot of mistakes, right? And I'm probably still gonna make mistakes, right? And so I think that's the power of vulnerability, right? Being vulnerable with your audience and not going in there with men acting like you're the most healthiest person, because we're not. Right? And so that I've seen that has allowed me to connect with people, and especially with men. Just being real with them. That's what it is. And as Dom said, speak their language. Now about engaging men into the field, that's a different topic. It's a little bit different, but like Quentin said, when I think of that, I think about more positions, more money, pay. We need, right? We need more money to open these positions for men to join the field, because yes, there's a lot of good men out there. I mean, most men are good, right? And they want to do good things, but you know, we want to bring them to the field, but we don't have the positions for them. So how is that going to happen, right? You know, and also, I mean, you know, people who do prevention work, we also know that people don't get paid very well. You know, that's another barrier. You know, and I'm not saying just pay men prevention is better. No, I'm saying pay all prevention is good, right? And I'm sure you'll have more males applying for the jobs. Because again, even though we are woke men over here, we still have that social pressure and influence, as Quentin was saying earlier in the conversation, about you got to make some money, you know. You got to provide, and that's real. Like we're woke, but that also social pressure and capitalism is real. It's here to stay, you know. And so that's what we have to invest more. And I know that we're doing the work. You know, just 2 weeks ago, it was Advocacy Day, and we were there, and we're doing the work to bring that those funds, right? But I think as many organizations out there, I think you know, many of you can do something about how much you are paying your staff, you know, and really compensate staff for what they do. If we really want to end domestic violence, as we said, right, as we say, right, and then let's invest in preventing violence. Let's invest that energy there. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Luis. I just want to thank everyone, and thank everyone who stayed on a little bit later. That was really wonderful, I think we can all say. And so, as I mentioned before, this will be posted in our resource library shortly, and we'll be sending out the recording, which Miranda, actually, we can probably stop now. Prevention team is going to